Our next speaker is Caitlyn Vernon. As the coastal campaigner with Sierra Club BC, Caitlyn Vernon works to keep our coast free from tar, sand, pipelines, and tankers. She recently wrote an award-winning nonfiction book for young readers called Nowhere Else on Earth, Standing Tall for the Great Bear Rainforest. Please welcome Caitlyn Vernon.
I want to talk tonight about how the way in which we oppress and exploit the natural world is connected to the way in which we exploit and oppress each other. And how, as we stop tankers and as we transition our society off of fossil fuels, if we're to build a society, if we're to build a world where we respect the earth, we also need to learn how to respect each other. So what does this mean in the context of pipelines and tankers and climate change? Let me start with a story. I grew up in East Vancouver. I grew up knowing that I lived in a place that had once been a forest with giant cedar trees and salmon streams. But I didn't know that I grew up in a place that had been shared by the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations for thousands of years. I grew up in a community that was fighting for workers' rights, fighting to end violence against women. I was surrounded by people working for peace and justice, working to end oppression. But I didn't realize, I didn't see how we ourselves are also oppressors. I didn't realize that the apartheid system in South Africa that we were protesting against was modeled after Canada's Indian reserves. And I didn't see how my family and I were benefiting from a state, a colonial state that promoted our interests at the expense of Aboriginal peoples and the health of their land. And so once I begin to see some of that, what do I do? What do I do with this? In the struggle to stop Enbridge and Kinder Morgan, we stand with First Nations who are also opposing these projects. But is this all it takes to be an ally? And so thinking about this, the thing is, it's not up to me to decide if I'm an ally or not. It's up to the First Nations to decide if they think I'm being an ally. Being an ally means standing with the First Nations in solidarity. But it's more than that. It also means taking direction from First Nations and taking responsibility for our side of the equation. It means knowing the past, bearing witness to what's happening in the present, apologizing for our shared histories, and taking responsibility for our own complicity in the ongoing oppression. Because here's the thing, those of us who are settlers to this land, whether we arrived recently or our ancestors arrived many generations ago, our privilege is based on the exploitation of the land and the dispossession of First Nations from their land. And this is a really uncomfortable truth, but there's no getting around it. First Nations were moved onto tiny reserves. Did you know that all of the reserves in BC make up less than half of 1% of the province? Moved onto tiny reserves so that European immigrants could buy and sell land and could profit from cutting down the trees, harvesting the fish, and digging the mines. And in BC, this was done largely without treaties, which for the record was actually in violation of British law. And so to this day, most of BC remains unceded land that the First Nations never gave up, land that we took and that we have profited from. So again, what does this have to do with tankers and climate change? Over 130 First Nations have signed the Save the Fraser Declaration, using their Indigenous laws to prohibit the transport of tar sands crude through their lands and waters. Here's the map showing all of the nations, actually there's more now, who have signed on to this declaration. They describe it as a wall of opposition that Enbridge and Kinder Morgan will not get through. So what would it mean for us to recognize First Nations decision-making authority? Does it mean we just give lip service to it and talk about it and say we recognize it? Or is it more? I think that ultimately recognizing First Nation decision-making authority means that those of us who are settlers to this land, we have to give up some of our power and privilege. We have to give up some of our decision-making authority. This might be hard to see, but from the perspective of our ecological footprint, this would mean that we actually need to make do with less. So let's just consider for a minute, what would it mean to live in a world that was both ecologically sustainable and socially just? On the left here, Neoclassical Economics, this is how our economy is supposed to work in theory, assumes that the ecosystem is just a subset of the economy and that the economy can grow forever. And so from this perspective, conditions can be improved for First Nations without the rest of us having to do anything differently, because there could be unlimited growth. Of course, on the right-hand side is a bit more how our world actually works, ecological economics. We live in a finite world. That means there's a limited source of materials and energies that can be pulled from the natural world, used in our economy, and then dumped back as waste. And so for those of us who are steeped in environmental issues, we know that living in a finite world means we have to reduce our consumption, cut back on our ecological footprint, stay within our carbon budget. But how does social justice play into this? Do we all have to cut back equally? Justice would dictate that those who've been oppressed should have access to increased opportunities. And so to increase opportunities for First Nations in a finite world, the total amount of economic activity and the amount of natural resources used by the rest of us has to decrease. The ecological pie can't get any bigger, so for justice as well as sustainability, there needs to be a redistribution of access to our remaining limited resources. So as we get involved in the fight for a future with salmon and whales and clean drinking water, we need to reflect on our own complicity in a system that leads to oppression not just of the land, but also of people. We need to take time to learn our histories, bear witness to the present, get to know our First Nation neighbors, and challenge some of the privileges that we take for granted. Thank you.